Now, the iconography of power into which images of women had to fit from 1500 on was established by powerful men. Images have always played, and still do play, an essential role in projecting power. In past centuries, most people only saw their monarch in profile on the coinage, and if they ever saw a portrait of him, it was in the form of a woodcut or an engraving. The prestige image was a painted portrait, and such portraits were often painted in multiple copies so that they could stand in for the real person in some far-flung corner of his territory. Horst Bredekamp calls this a substitutive image act. And here's an example of this very thing. This is India. It is the Viceroy of India, Lord Lytton, seated on a throne, and he's receiving the Nepalese ambassadors, but he's doing so, as it were, as the instrument of Queen Victoria, who is depicted above him in a larger than life-size portrait. She is the one who is greeting the ambassadors. She's the one who's conferring honours and decorations. So portraits can stand in for a powerful person when they cannot themselves be there. She never visited India, but her portraits were all over India. All rulers and all powerful figures, whether male or female, to this day, have themselves portrayed when they come into office, and they use that portrayal to represent them and to convey how they wish to be seen. The state portrait in oils of the newly crowned monarch, even today, is a sine qua non of royal image making, in which regal symbols are essential attributes. But it's not actually that different in the case of an American president. He too, and so far it is only he, is always photographed. There's always an official photograph taken in the Oval Office in front of the American flags. And note that framed photographs of the family are equally essential attributes. I mean, if it's a king, he has a crown and a scepter. If it's an American president, it's a picture of himself and his children. Now, the medium has changed hugely between 1500 and 2000 or 2022, but the intention is now, and was then, to convey a particular view of the powerful man, to which the public, as we say nowadays, in earlier times the subjects, have to assent. Now, in earlier centuries, magnificence was essential to the depiction, and so was masculinity. Look at the way Henry VIII is standing. We have all seen men standing like this, haven't we? And look at his enormous codpiece, which is, jutting out between the skirts of his tunic. The ruler has to appear virile, capable of fathering sons, though, of course, as we know, Henry VIII famously only had legitimate daughters. Look at these two. These are two absolutely enormous pictures. Louis XIV measures 2.77 meters by 1.94 meters, and Charles I measures 3.68 meters by 2.7 meters. This means that the person viewing the portrait is always positioned down on the ground, looking up at the monarch. Louis XIV's portrait, painted when he was 63, exudes majesty and authority. And so does Charles I's. We, the viewer, are in the same position as the master of horse, Monsieur de Saint-Antoine, who is also depicted in Charles's portrait, gazing up at the monarch on horseback, holding the marshal's baton. And again, Louis XIV engaged in the substitutive image act because he sent a copy of this very portrait to Spain with his grandson, Philip V, when he became the first Bourbon King of Spain. Again, Louis XIV is saying, yes, I'm in Versailles, but I am also in Spain. The male ruler also had to appear physically capable of leading an army into battle. And once military uniform became established in national armies from around 1700, rulers were most often portrayed wearing it. And from the 19th century on, they were seldom depicted wearing anything but military uniform. This also reflected the fact, of course, that the army was a central pillar of their power. On the right, as you look at the picture, you recognize, of course, Wilhelm II, the last German emperor. He had a withered left arm, but he loved everything to do with both the army and the navy, and he continued to have himself painted in various uniforms even after his abdication and during his 23-year exile in the Netherlands. It was the 19th century that saw a revolution in image making only comparable to the digital developments of our own day, and this is the invention of photography around 1830. In 1854, André-Adolphe Eugène Disdéry invented what was called the carte de visite. This is a small photograph, usually of a famous or powerful person, measuring 54 millimeters by 89 millimeters and pasted onto thicker card. 270,000 images of the British royal family were apparently sold in the first months of the invention, and this image, Napoleon III, was another strong seller. You see, compare this with the official painted coronation portrait in the middle here of Napoleon III, and here he is on the carte de visite. This brings him much closer to his subjects. It shows him in a less godlike pose. He's wearing ordinary clothes. He's standing next to an ordinary armchair in front of a table. And once the Kodak camera enabled ordinary citizens to take snapshots from 1900, royal, imperial, important persons lost control over their own image and the mass media did the rest. By 1915, the Berliner Illustrierte Zeitung, founded in 1892, had a circulation of an astonishing 800,000 copies and often published photographs of royal personages. These images of the powerful wearing ordinary clothes, such as their subjects might wear, goes back to those instances around 1800 when rulers such as Napoleon or Franz I, Emperor of Austria, had themselves depicted at their desks as servants of the people. I mean, this is France, you know, working hard, table covered with papers. He's saying, see, here I am, there I am, wearing the same clothes as you, and I'm working on your behalf. He's all alone. His only companion is the little canary on the very right of the picture in a cage, a real Biedermeier touch. If we look at this photograph of the meeting of Churchill, Truman and Stalin in Potsdam in 1945, we see, however, that Churchill and Stalin are in uniform. I mean, it's not full dress uniform, but still they're in uniform. And Truman, even though he had served in World War I, is just wearing an ordinary lounge suit. Now, what about the demonstration of masculinity and virility that we saw in the case of Henry VIII, Louis XIV, etc.? That this was still called for in modern times, even in democratically elected leaders, can be seen by the fact that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt avoided being photographed in a wheelchair. He could only walk a few steps with the help of assistants and went virtually everywhere by car because he thought that people would not believe that he could govern if they saw that he was physically weak and disabled. And we still see this demonstration of masculinity in the many photographs and films of President Zelensky. He wears only military clothing to convey that he's a leader in a time of war, and his bulging arm and chest muscles are evidence of the daily workout that we know he does. His beard distances him from the clean-shaven comedian that he used to be. This, in contrast, is the modern politician in his uniform, the business suit, which conveys two ideas. We are servants of the people, on the one hand, and on the other, by dressing like bankers, we are demonstrating that we can be trusted to run the economy. So, while official images of powerful men in earlier centuries conveyed above all magnificence, authority, majesty, potency, and military prowess, modern depictions of elected leaders have to show political competence, but they still need, in certain circumstances, to show military competence and masculinity. So, how did powerful women fit their images into this established iconography? And what do we mean by a powerful woman? In order to be powerful in a monarchical system, a queen has to rule in her own right. That is, she has to be a queen regnant, not a queen consort. A queen consort is the wife, the spouse of a king. But a queen regnant, and in many territories, for instance, France, this was constitutionally impossible. A woman was not allowed to succeed her father, even if he had no sons. Not so in England. So many of the queens regnant in history were queens of England or later of Great Britain, and here is just a small selection. So there's a whole bunch of English or British queens first, and then two very powerful ladies, Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, and Maria Theresia, who ruled as King of Hungary and Bohemia, and then actually the unusual example of Poland. Poland is very unusual in many ways. They have an elective monarchy, but a woman could also rule, and she ruled jointly with a man she married in a marriage of convenience when she was over 50. So how did these women fit into or adapt? This is Anna Jagiellon. How did these women, queens regnant, fit into or adapt male iconography? Now, a good place to start is with Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII. Remember the picture I just showed you of Henry VIII clothed in rich fabrics, covered in jewels, to make his kingship visible. And she does exactly the same. Look at the amount of jewelry that she's wearing in this portrait. If kingship demanded masculinity and virility of men, it demanded beauty of women. Elizabeth used jewels and rich fabrics to present herself as beautiful in her portraits, and the artists who painted her were told to give her the same unvaryingly youthful countenance. This was called the mask of youth, and she appears, her face appears like this for the next 20 years. She was not allowed to age in her portraits. Now, she's very unusual because she rejected the idea that as a woman, her body existed to bear children. She refused to marry, and she created the persona of the Virgin Queen, whose courtiers had to adore her as part of the game of courtly love. In July 1588, she plays with the idea that a woman's body may be weaker than a man's, but she maintains that this is no impediment to rule. You can see part of this quotation. You can actually read it, I think, fairly easily down at the bottom of this paper. Now, she became queen under a dynastic system that allowed her, as the only living child of Henry VIII, to succeed her sister, Queen Mary, who in turn had succeeded Henry VIII. Now, this system depends crucially on women's bodies, for they give birth to the legitimate heir. Women who rule in their own right were also expected to give birth to enable the dynasty to survive, and Elizabeth I is the exceptional woman who refused to do this and was therefore succeeded by her cousin James VI of Scotland. Now, here is another remarkable woman who ruled as a monarch and who used costume and regal symbols, the crown, the scepter, the orb, to demonstrate her power and status. This is Sophie Friederike Auguste von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornburg, better known to history as Catherine II the Great. She did give birth to an heir, the future Alexander I Petrovich, and to a daughter, before she forced her husband to abdicate, and then he died, and she proclaimed herself empress in 1762. She did not, however, use the iconography of motherhood as part of her self-presentation. Like other 18th century male rulers, she rather had herself depicted in military uniform and on horseback, riding astride like a man, as you see here, indicating that she's the commander-in-chief of the army. There's a very good article by Christina Strunk about all of this. Now, Maria Theresia used iconography rather differently. As a woman, she could not constitutionally be elected Holy Roman Emperor in succession to her father Karl VI. So she married Franz Stephan of Lorraine, who was then elected emperor as Franz I. However, thanks to the pragmatic sanction negotiated by her father, she could rule in her own right over the Austrian crown lands and could be crowned king of Hungary and of Bohemia. Now, an essential part of the coronation of a Hungarian king is the ride up a hill made of soil from all the provinces of the kingdom. And the king draws his sword and rides up this hill to proclaim his kingship, and that's exactly what she did. In this very different image, we are struck by the magnificence here of the fabrics she's wearing and the fabrics of the curtains on either side of her, but the point of the portrait is the scepter she's holding and the crowns on the cushion next to her, to all of which she was entitled. The Hungarian crown of St. Stephen, the Bohemian crown of St. Wenceslas, the Archducal crown of Austria, and the Rudolphine house crown of the Habsburgs. Now, she may have been a king, 4 times over, but she was also a mother who bore her husband 16 children, 7 of whom predeceased her, not all of them as babies, but 3 of them as babies, as you see in the front of this collection of children. It was taken for granted that within the structure of Christian marriage, a queen should bear children, and Maria Theresia integrated her role as wife and mother into her image, depicting herself as Mother of the Nation, the Landesmutter. Queen Victoria is doing the same here. She, her husband and their family are being presented as exemplars of what the Christian family should be, in which the superior political position of the wife does not displace the husband from his place in the center of the family. And look how similar this is. This is the late Queen Elizabeth II with her 4 children, who's in the center of the portrait photograph, her husband, the late Prince Philip. What caused ridiculous spasms of amazement when Jacinda Ardern, an elected head of state, became pregnant. I mean, quite ridiculous. Typical is the nonsensical statement on the cover of this magazine, which you can probably read, that Ardern is, I quote, only the 2nd world leader to give birth while in office. I can hear Maria Theresia and Queen Victoria snorting in derision at this ridiculous false statement. Now, if Queen's Regnant has a choice as to whether they built motherliness into their image or not, for Queen's Consort, it was the justification for their existence. So they had to be painted with their children. A Queen Consort who did not give her husband an heir was in deep trouble, for she was considered to have failed in her primary purpose. And for many years, this was the fate of Marie Antoinette. The young Louis XVI, her husband, did not know how to consummate the sexual act. So Marie Antoinette did not become pregnant until 8 years after her marriage, which made her position at court very difficult and gave rise to huge public criticism. It was not until her brother, Emperor Joseph II, came to Versailles in 1778 and instructed Louis what to do in bed, that she finally became pregnant and produced an heir. And here we see her with 3 of her children, and the empty cradle stands for her second daughter, Sophie Hélène Béatrix, who had just died at the age of 11 months. This portrait with her children was commissioned by Louis XVI to vindicate her in the face of all the public criticism. But it didn't really work. They carried on criticizing her as, l'Autrichienne and so on. Now, in a successful marriage, a queen consort could exert considerable influence over her husband, to such an extent that it has even been claimed in some cases that she was almost a co-ruler. But note that the important term is influence, for constitutionally a consort has no political power. She could acquire power, however limited, as a queen regent, that is ruling on behalf of an underage son. And this is what happened to the Spanish princess Anne of Austria, depicted here as a widow. She came to France in 1615 as a 14-year-old bride, the bride of Louis XIII. Sexual relations between the young couple were non-existent for years, for 20 years, so that she did not become pregnant until 1638, when she was 37 years old. She fortunately gave birth to a male heir, the future Louis XIV, and 2 years later gave birth to another son. The young boy still in skirts on the right of the picture as you look at it. When her husband died in 1643, she became Queen Regent because Louis XIV was a minor. She was, of course, guided by a regency council of men, but she was far more powerful and influential as a widow than she had ever been as a wife. She remained Queen Regent until Louis came of age in 1651, and this is only one of many images that she commissioned to document her status as mother and regent. In this engraving, Louis holds the scepter. I mean, he is actually now king because his father has died, but look at her hand supporting his. And the laurel wreath that she's holding indicates the victory at the Battle of Rocroi in the 30 Years' War, when the French defeated the Spanish. So in a sense, while she in no way could claim to be a military commander and certainly doesn't look like one, at the same time she's saying that under my regency, look how successful our troops are. Now, this is a very different picture, dating to 1648-49. It shows us another powerful widow, a dowager, the Dowager Electress of Brandenburg. She is seated here. And she's been glorified as the Queen of Sheba. The crowded canvas illustrates a series of unions between the Reformed, that is Calvinist, dynasties of the Palatinate, die Pfalz, Brandenburg, Orange-Nassau, and Hessen-Kassel over several generations. And the first of these marriages was celebrated by Elizabeth Charlotte herself when she married the Georg Wilhelm, the Elector of Brandenburg, he's dead now. I mean, she's a widow, so he's depicted on the left of the picture as you look at it. Her mother was a princess of the Calvinist House of Orange. Her brother was Friedrich V, Elector Palatine, the Winter King. So she was Calvinist royalty, you might say. She's presenting her son, Friedrich Wilhelm. He's the one in the striped orange costume, standing, you know, in the middle of the picture. This is the great Elector of Brandenburg, and she's presenting him with the treasures of her house, symbolized by the valuables in the chest at her feet. And this is her brother kneeling there with his hand on the chest full of valuables, and he's holding up a chalice with two hosts, Calvinism. Now, if we had a lot of time, and if we have time later, I can tell you who all these people are. Her daughter, her daughter-in-law, their husbands, this network of, as it were, important Calvinist figures. But what I'd like you to notice is not just the pride, as it were, in this successful network which survived the 30 Years' War, but the importance of the role of women within it. When they marry into the Hohenzollerns or the Wittelsbachs or the House of Orange, as it were, they bring a Calvinist identity with them. So this painting, and as I say, I can tell you who all the people are later, but we would need a little bit of time. It bears witness to the role of women in the dynastic system, and it also shows that though a consort was expected to align herself with her husband's dynasty. I mean, Elizabeth Charlotte marries a Hohenzollern and becomes Electress of Brandenburg, but she herself is still loyal to her own identity as a member of the dynasty in the Palatinate. And this is typical of Queen's consort. Now, down at the bottom of this family tree, the small medallion at the bottom, this is Hedwig Eleonore, Queen of Sweden, the powerful and long-lived dowager Queen Mother and then Queen Grandmother of Sweden. And it's an excellent example of a woman demonstrating and claiming her own identity, no matter how long she has been married into a different dynasty. I mean, the extraordinary thing about this is that Hedwig Eleonore has been in Sweden now for 50 years, and she's a woman of 70. She came to Sweden when she was 18 to marry Karl X Gustav. But she's never forgotten her own origins. And in fact, in her various palaces, she had whole galleries, portrait galleries of members of all the European royals and important people, aristocrats, to whom she was related. Now, she had the great good fortune to give birth to twins. And this is the man standing on the left of this picture, the left as you look at it. This is the next king, Karl XI. She gave birth to him in 1655, and a couple of years later her husband died, so she then became a widow in 1660, and of course became regent for her underage son, an office she filled until 1672. Now, you might think that when her son married, she, as the Queen Dowager, would take a back seat and let his wife come to the fore. Not a bit of it. Hedwig Eleonore remained dominant for the next decades. You see her seated wearing ermine, the sign of royalty, next to her son. She's pointing at her grandson, the future Karl XII, who's depicted here as a little naked Cupid figure. Now, on the right, no jewelry, all dishabille. This is her daughter-in-law, Ulrike Eleonore of Denmark. The figure in the portrait above is, of course, Hedwig Eleonore's late husband. Now, Karl XI predeceased his mother in 1697, and she became member for the second time of a Regency Council, this time during the minority of her grandson, the baby boy here, and she now became known as the Queen Grandmother of Sweden. She outlived almost her entire family, her widowhood lasting for 55 years until her death in 1715. And we see something very similar with Maria Theresia as a powerful widow who continued to rule over the territories of which she was sovereign in her own right. And Maria Theresia's son, Joseph II, on the right of the picture as you look at it, was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1765. She ruled jointly with him. She remained as powerful in her widowhood as Hedwig Eleonora had. Now, Queen's Consort exerted and still exert what we today call soft power, and essential in that power is their public portrayal. Just like Anne of Austria, Henrietta Maria, Marie Antoinette, they have to be portrayed with their children. This is Augusta Victoria at the end of the 19th century with her 7 children, 6 sons and 1 daughter. But here are 2 modern examples, the late Diana, Princess of Wales, and the present Princess of Wales. Now, apart from bearing children, what else does a Queen Consort have to do? She has to be present on ceremonial occasions, and on these occasions, she has to wear certain headgear, namely a tiara. This is Eugénie, Empress of the French, receiving the Siamese ambassadors at, I think it was in Compiègne. This is a modern Queen Consort. She's a modern woman in all sorts of ways, but she still has to wear a tiara on state occasions. And consorts also have to wear strange hats. Again, something which is, a headgear unknown to the ordinary woman. They have to engage in charitable works. This again is going back to Empress Eugénie. Her visits to cholera victims in Amiens were publicized by engravings of this portrait, which saw her bending over very close to these cholera victims. I mean, cholera victims were regarded practically like lepers, and it was her visits to the hospital that enabled them to be given far more compassion. And we are, of course, reminded here of the very young late Diana, Princess of Wales, holding the hand of a man with HIV in 1987, and the fact that she's not wearing a glove, she's holding his hand. And again, this was a big move towards people not regarding those who were ill with HIV as lepers. So good deeds are part of what a Queen's Consort has to do. And here we see, again, go back to Augusta Victoria, unsere Landesmutter during the First World War. And these kind of good deeds are considered essential if you are a princess or a queen consort. Now, what I want to stress is that it is the images that are essential to all of this. There's no point in, playing with Indian children or visiting cholera victims if it is not depicted. So it's the powerful nature of the depiction. Now, what happened when women became important, not because of who their husband or their son was, not because of their actions as consorts in search of a role, but because they had been elected democratically? Images were powerful here too, in the first instance because they documented the existence of such women. Here are the first elected members of the Weimar Parliament. And here are the first women elected to the British Parliament 10 years later. The images reveal the women to be dressed in the same dark, somber clothing as their male colleagues, avoiding fashion or frivolity, and of course, covering their bodies. Neither in 1919 nor in 1929 would it have been possible for any of these women to have worn trousers? And in fact, there was actually uproar in the British Parliament when one of the women actually wore a green dress as opposed to a black dress. Now, this is an interesting woman called Helene Charlotte von Bodmer, SPD. The Vice President of the Bundestag, Richard Jäger, CSU, declared that he would never allow a woman in trousers to enter the Bundestag, and he certainly wouldn't allow a woman wearing trousers to give a speech in the Bundestag. When Frau von Bodmer heard this, she immediately went out and she bought a trouser suit. I mean, she'd already entered the Bundestag wearing trousers in April 1970. And when he said a woman wearing trousers would never, more or less over his dead body, give a speech wearing trousers, she went out and she bought a trouser suit in a light coloured, obviously make her more visible, and she gave a speech on the 14th of October 1970 wearing it. This is not, by the way, Richard Jäger next to her. She's talking to one of the clerks of the Parliament about giving her speech. Now, what about government leaders and holders of great offices of state today? This is women who are government leaders and holders of great offices of state. Margaret Thatcher, British Prime Minister for 15 years, someone who changed British society forever, well, for better and for worse, during her time in office, always projected an overtly feminine appearance. She always wore a skirt. She always wore jewellery. There was always the pearl necklace, the brooch. She always carried a handbag. She always had this immaculately coiffed hair. She often had a bow at her neck. More recent office holders have chosen trousers. It's possible to wear them with flatter shoes, and they are far more practical than a skirt for getting in and out of limousines. So here's Hillary Clinton, who chose as a uniform the colourful trouser suit. Beside its practicality, it also made her highly visible. And Angela Merkel chose a similar timeless uniform. Black trousers in winter, light-coloured trousers in summer, but with simply tailored, colourful jackets. This is a uniform which is comfortable and makes her visible, but it does away with any discussion about fashion. There is no discussion because we all know what Frau Merkel always wore: dark trousers in winter, light trousers in summer, colourful jacket. End of discussion. And we can see that Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Council, does exactly the same. By the way, I'd like you to notice Justin Trudeau on the extreme left of the picture as you look at it, standing just like Henry VIII did back in, 15, whatever it was, 50. To finish, women are identified with their clothes to a far greater extent than men are. And if their choice can be sexualized in some way, then the media will do so. And Angela Merkel shut that possibility down right from the start. Now, to finish with a quote from Horst Bredekamp, politics requires images. It gives rise to images, but it can also follow where images may lead. End of quote. Powerful women from Elizabeth I to Angela Merkel have often used images to make a point about their role that they could not make in any other way. But images also often reveal how the men around them reacted to the sight of a woman in power. Thank you very much indeed.